When officers surrounded her, she didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out something that made every cop freeze. One racist phone call had turned a quiet morning into chaos. But what happened when the millionaire boss arrived and when the woman's true identity was revealed left the entire neighborhood speechless. Stay with me because this is the story of how dignity defeated hate in the most powerful way imaginable. Before we dive in, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Let's see just how far this story can travel across the globe. There are mornings when the world feels like it's holding its breath, when the quiet isn't peace but tension waiting to snap. In the gated streets of Willow Creek, a suburb outside Dallas, the sun spilled over manicured lawns and freshly painted shutters as if to prove that nothing ugly could exist there. But behind the neat hedges and white fences, one window concealed a bitterness that was about to shatter that illusion. Diane Mercer stood at her kitchen counter, phone in hand, her eyes fixed on the mansion across the cul-de-sac. The house belonged to the Bennetts, a family who had moved in only 2 years ago, but seemed to carry themselves as if they had been royalty for generations. To Diane, every car in the driveway, every gathering in the backyard, every delivery at the front door was a reminder that she had lost control of her own story. She had retired early not by choice but by necessity, cut loose from a career she had once bragged about. Now her days stretched empty, filled with routines of coffee, gossip blogs, and suspicion about people who had done nothing to her except succeed where she hadn't. She spotted movement inside the Bennett's house and narrowed her eyes. A black woman moved gracefully through the living room, dusting the shelves and adjusting the curtains. Diane's jaw tightened. She told herself it was concern for the neighborhood, for safety, for the rules everyone was supposed to live by. But beneath those excuses lay envy that gnawed at her like rust. She had never spoken to the woman, not once in the years the Bennetts had lived next door, but she had created a narrative about her anyway. She doesn't belong here, Diane muttered under her breath, though no one was there to hear it. Her fingers moved before her conscience could stop them. She dialed 911, her voice snapping into an authority she didn't deserve. "Yes, I need to report a burglary," she said crisply, pressing her lips into a firm line as though to steady the lie. "There's a black woman inside my neighbor's house. He's not home. I saw him leave last night with luggage. She's rifling through everything. I'm sure she's stealing." She leaned against the counter, peering through the blinds as if she were the only guardian of a fragile order. Every word she spoke dripped with certainty, and the dispatcher's calm questions only fueled her performance. "How long will it take you to get here?" Diane added, layering her false urgency with just enough fear. She could be passing information to a gang. You know how these people operate. Across the street, Althea Brooks hummed softly as she worked, her voice low but steady, the kind of humming that comes from muscle memory and years of turning quiet spaces into order. At 41, she had built her life around service, not because she was weak, but because she knew dignity wasn't defined by a paycheck. Her hands moved with confidence as she polished a silver-framed photo of the Bennett children, their smiling faces evidence of trust she had earned long ago. Althea had keys, alarm codes, routines memorized down to the minute. She knew which plants needed misting, and which drawers stuck when pulled too quickly. To her, this house was not just a workplace, it was an extension of the respect the Bennetts had shown her since the first day she arrived. She had no idea that across the street a woman's envy had twisted itself into malice, and that police sirens were already slicing through traffic to answer a call built on prejudice. The sound reached faintly at first, no different from an ambulance rushing to some emergency on another block. Althea didn't even pause her movements. She switched on the vacuum, the low rumble blending with the hum of the air conditioner. But as the sirens grew louder, closer, she turned her head slightly, brows furrowing. Outside, Diane's lips curled into a thin smile. She pulled back the curtain just enough to watch as 3 patrol cars turned the corner, lights flashing, engines growling. The sight sent a surge of satisfaction through her chest, a bitter relief that she had regained some control over her world. Finally, she thought, finally someone would take her seriously. Diane hurried out to the sidewalk, waving her hands like a vigilant neighbor doing her duty. "Officers," she called, her voice sharp with self-importance. "Thank God you're here so quickly. She's still inside. I've been watching the whole time." Her arms folded across her chest as though that could disguise the thrill running through her. To her, this was more than about one woman cleaning a house. It was about reasserting herself as someone who mattered in a neighborhood that had left her behind. Inside, Althea unplugged the vacuum when she heard the pounding on the door. It wasn't a knock of courtesy, it was the fist of suspicion, loud and violent. Her heart beat faster, but not from guilt. This wasn't the first time she had been mistaken for someone who didn't belong. Experience had taught her to carry calm like armor, to meet hostility with composure. She placed the vacuum aside and smoothed her palms over her skirt, whispering to herself the same words she had whispered in countless other tense moments. "Walk steady. Speak clear. Let them see you, not their fear of you." She reached for her purse on the side table, her fingers brushing the worn leather of the wallet that carried more than money, it carried her story. With a quiet breath, she opened the door, the morning light spilling in alongside the hard stares of uniformed officers. Diane stood behind them, triumphant, her eyes hungry for the humiliation she was certain would come. But Althea didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly, her expression calm, her voice measured. "Good morning, officers," she said evenly. "I imagine you're here because of the neighbor's call." The words fell into the air like a quiet challenge, and for the first time that morning it wasn't Diane who seemed in control. It was the woman she had tried to erase with a single phone call. And as the officers adjusted their postures and prepared to speak, Althea slipped her hand back into her purse, touching the second card she carried, the one Diane Mercer could never have predicted, the one that would turn the next hours into a reckoning. The rumble of the engines filled the cul-de-sac, louder than any passing ambulance, more jarring than the quiet hum of morning traffic. Red and blue lights spun against the white walls of the Bennett home, painting the manicured hedges in harsh colors. For a moment it seemed as though a war zone had descended on a neighborhood where nothing more serious than a broken mailbox had ever happened. Diane Mercer stood with her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her lips pursed in satisfaction as the first officer stepped out of his vehicle. This was her stage now, her performance unfolding exactly as she had envisioned when she picked up the phone. "Officers," she called again, her voice raised but trembling slightly with excitement. "She's still inside. She's been in there for half an hour. I know she doesn't belong." Her words cut through the stillness, but her tone betrayed her, carrying the shrill edge of someone who needed to be believed more than someone who was genuinely afraid. The lead officer, Sergeant Klein, glanced at her only briefly before signaling to his partners. His posture was stiff, professional, the kind that came from years of responding to calls where every second mattered. Yet something in Diane's urgency felt rehearsed, too eager, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment not to protect anyone but to prove a point. Inside the house, Althea Brooks felt the vibrations of boots striking the front porch. She steadied her breathing, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She had lived enough life to know that her calmness would be tested, that the wrong word or wrong gesture could tilt this morning into disaster. Still, she reminded herself that she had nothing to hide, that truth, even when doubted, had a way of standing firm. She opened the door before they could pound again, the hinges creaking softly as 3 uniformed men and 1 woman faced her in a line. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady, her tone neither defensive nor meek. "I believe you're here because of a call my neighbor made." The officers exchanged quick glances. Behind them, Diane was practically shaking with anticipation, leaning forward as if to savor the moment she thought was coming. She expected stammering, excuses, fumbling hands, but Althea only stood with a quiet poise that unsettled the narrative Diane had built. "We'll need to see some identification, ma'am," Sergeant Klein said, his voice formal, practiced. Althea nodded and reached into her purse with deliberate slowness, showing both hands, never moving too quickly. Her years of experience in situations like this had taught her one unshakable truth: survival was often in the details. She retrieved her wallet and handed over her driver's license along with a keychain heavy with keys. "These are the house keys provided to me by the Bennetts," she explained, her eyes meeting the sergeant's directly.
I have worked here for nearly 4 years, every Tuesday and Thursday from 8 until 5. The family is currently traveling, but they left me with full responsibility for the property. Her words were clear, precise, threaded with confidence that did not waver, yet Diane's voice sliced through before the officer could even respond. "Don't believe her," she snapped, stepping closer to the porch. "Anyone can make a copy of a key. Anyone can forge a license. She's lying. I know she is. People like her always have a story." The phrase hung heavy in the air. People like her. The officers shifted uneasily, one of them scribbling something in a small notebook. Sergeant Klein didn't answer Diane right away. Instead, he studied Althea, noting how she didn't shrink back, didn't fumble, didn't lose her composure even with an accusation thrown like a knife. Her stillness spoke louder than any protest could have. "Ma'am," the sergeant said carefully, "can you provide the contact information for the homeowners?" "Of course," Althea replied, already unlocking her phone. "I can call Dr. Bennett right now. She is in Houston for a conference, but she will confirm everything." Her tone carried the calmness of truth, but beneath it lay exhaustion. She had done this before, proved herself again and again to people who saw only her skin first and her humanity second. From the sidewalk, Diane erupted. "Oh, come on. She could be calling anyone, pretending to be speaking to some doctor. Can't you see what she's doing? You're being fooled, and this neighborhood is going to pay for it." Her face flushed red, her voice rising until it cracked. She was unraveling, and the officers were beginning to notice. Althea's eyes flickered briefly toward her but then returned to the officers. She pulled another card from her wallet and held it out with a subtle smile. It wasn't her driver's license this time. It wasn't a family contact list or a phone number scribbled on paper. It was something else, something that made Sergeant Klein's expression change almost instantly. He held it longer than necessary, scanning the emblem, the name, the title. His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time, respect softened his features. Diane squinted, desperate to see what the card was, but the distance kept her blind. All she saw was the shift in posture, the straightening of backs, the nods that passed between officers. Confusion knotted in her stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had pictured handcuffs, resistance, her neighbors applauding her vigilance. Instead, the woman she had branded a criminal was standing calmly, her dignity untouched, while the officer's suspicion began to turn elsewhere.
Althea slipped her phone back into her pocket. "Would you like to come inside?" she asked softly. "I can show you everything. Alarm system codes, valuables exactly where they've always been, documentation from the family, whatever you need to be assured that I belong here." The sergeant hesitated, not because he doubted her, but because the sudden ease in his chest contrasted so sharply with the panic radiating from Diane. "That may be wise," he said, then added, "but we'll wait here a moment longer." His eyes drifted toward Diane, whose breathing had grown heavy, whose words were tumbling over themselves in half-formed accusations. "You're making a mistake," Diane spat, her fists clenching at her sides. "She's putting on an act. They're all good at that. Don't you see? She's manipulating you." But even as she spoke, the certainty in her voice faltered. The officer's expressions no longer mirrored her urgency. Althea's calm composure had planted doubt, and doubt was all it took for Diane's story to begin crumbling. Inside her chest, Althea felt the ache of familiarity, the same ache that had followed her through other neighborhoods, other jobs, other mornings, when her presence alone had been enough to make someone call her dangerous. But she did not let that ache show. She stood steady, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her eyes level, her voice patient, because she knew something Diane did not. This was only the beginning. The truth always had a way of surfacing, and when it didn't just wash over lies, it drowned them. And outside, as Diane Mercer struggled to hold her story together with trembling words, the sound of an approaching vehicle drifted down the street, tires crunching against gravel, an engine purring with practiced luxury. Althea recognized it immediately. A quiet relief touched her face, so subtle the officers almost missed it. For Diane, though, it was the first whisper of dread, because whoever was about to step out of that car would not just bring confirmation, they would change the entire balance of the morning. And with it, the course of Diane's carefully built illusion. The purr of the engine rolled into the cul-de-sac, like an uninvited truth, undeniable and steady. The officers turned instinctively toward the sound, their postures alert but not hostile. Diane Mercer's face drained of color, her hands twitching at her sides as a sleek black SUV came to a smooth halt in front of the Bennett home. The door opened, and out stepped Dr. Lorraine Bennett, her presence commanding even before she spoke a single word. She was dressed in a simple navy suit, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp with focus, the same focus that had earned her respect as one of the most skilled pediatric surgeons in the city. But there was no surgical mask today, no hospital corridors. This was her home, her sanctuary, and the sight that greeted her was anything but routine. Althea Brooks exhaled softly as Lorraine approached, a wave of quiet relief sweeping across her features. She had called for this moment not out of fear but out of necessity, because sometimes even the truth needed a witness with power to be heard. Diane, however, felt her stomach twist. She had not expected the Bennetts to return so soon, not expected to be caught mid-accusation. Her plan had been simple: let the police drag the maid out, let the neighborhood watch her victory, but the script she had written in her mind was unraveling before her eyes. Althea, Lorraine's voice broke through the tension as she crossed the yard, her heels clicking against the pavement with the certainty of someone who belonged in every space she entered. Are you all right? There was no formality, no distant employer-employee relationship in her tone. It was warm, familiar, protective. She reached for Althea's hands as though they were family. The embrace that followed was not one of a boss comforting staff. It was a sisterhood, a bond forged from years of trust and mutual respect. The officers exchanged quick glances, the contrast unmistakable. Here was the woman Diane had painted as a trespasser, standing embraced by the very homeowner she was accused of robbing. The neighbor's story was beginning to fray like fabric tugged at the edges. Lorraine turned her gaze to the officers, her expression sharpening. Would one of you care to explain why I'm being called away from my conference to find my housekeeper surrounded by squad cars as if she's committed a crime? Her tone was steady, but beneath it ran a current of indignation. Sergeant Klein cleared his throat. We received a call, Dr. Bennett. A neighbor reported suspicious activity in your home. We're here to confirm authorization. Suspicious activity? Lorraine's eyebrows rose, her voice slicing the air with disbelief. She turned toward Diane, who lingered by the curb, her body stiff, her face flushed. You, Lorraine said, her voice no longer warm. You're the one who called them, aren't you? Diane opened her mouth, but her words stumbled. I thought, well, I saw someone in your house. I thought you were gone. I was protecting the neighborhood. The excuse sounded flimsy, even to her own ears. Lorraine stepped closer, her eyes unblinking. Protecting the neighborhood, she repeated, each syllable pronounced with quiet fury. From a woman who has been part of my household for nearly 4 years. From the person I trust more than anyone to care for my children when I can't be here. That's who you decided to protect us from. The words hit Diane like stones, each one stripping away another layer of her self-righteousness. She shifted her weight, but the ground beneath her felt unstable, as if every pair of eyes in the cul-de-sac was turning on her. Althea stood silently through it all, her composure unshaken. She had learned that sometimes silence spoke louder than defense, that dignity could expose lies more effectively than shouting. Yet even in her quietness, her heart ached. How many times would she have to be validated by someone else's presence before her word was enough? How many times would her honesty be measured against prejudice before it carried its own weight? The officers, caught between procedure and the reality unfolding before them, began to shift uncomfortably. Officer Ruiz, the youngest of the group, lowered his notepad. Dr. Bennett, he said softly, your employee provided identification and house keys. She also offered us additional documentation. We were in the process of verifying. Lorraine's eyes narrowed. And you needed 3 patrol cars to verify? You needed flashing lights and loud sirens to investigate a woman carrying my keys, standing in my home, doing the very work I asked her to do. Her voice carried the sting of disappointment, not just toward Diane, but toward the entire scene. Diane's temper, frayed by the growing humiliation, finally snapped. "You don't understand," she blurted. "You've been away. You don't know what it's like. The strange cars, the noise. I saw her rummaging. She could have been taking things. People like her always know how to make it look innocent." The phrase once again poisoned the air. People like her. Lorraine's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She took a slow breath, forcing control back into her voice. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked coldly. "Do you understand what you're admitting right now? You didn't call the police because you saw a crime. You called them because of who she is, because of what you decided she must be. That's not protecting a neighborhood, Diane. That's prejudice." The silence that followed was suffocating. The officers looked away, uncomfortable. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Althea stood still, her eyes fixed on the woman who had tried to dismantle her dignity with a single phone call. And Diane, her face hot with shame and fury, could only mutter, "I was just trying to help." But even as she said it, she knew the words were hollow. No one believed her anymore. Not the officers, not Lorraine, not even herself. She had crossed a line, and now the weight of her choices pressed down like a stone. Lorraine turned back to Althea, her expression softening again. "You shouldn't have to endure this," she said quietly. "Not in my home, not anywhere." Althea managed a small smile, though it was touched with sadness. "It's not the first time," she replied, her voice carrying both resignation and strength. "But maybe it can be one of the last." She glanced briefly toward Diane, her eyes calm, almost pitying. Because pity was sometimes the sharpest blade of all. The acknowledgement that the one who tried to wound you had only managed to wound themselves. The moment lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, until another sound interrupted it, the low growl of another vehicle pulling into the street. Sleek, dark, and deliberate, it stopped just behind Lorraine's SUV. A tall figure stepped out, carrying a leather case, and walking with the confidence of someone who had been summoned not just as a witness, but as a reckoning. Diane felt her stomach plummet, dread coiling inside her. Whoever this was, she realized, would be the end of the thin thread of authority she had been clinging to. And Althea, standing quietly at the doorway, recognized the footsteps immediately. She had called for more than validation. She had called for justice. The second car's arrival shifted the entire atmosphere of the cul-de-sac. If Lorraine Bennett's presence had disrupted Diane Mercer's fragile control, the newcomer's presence shattered it completely. The man who stepped out of the black sedan was tall, his salt and pepper hair trimmed neatly, his suit tailored in a way that spoke of authority rather than vanity. He carried a slim leather case, and walked with a calm but undeniable weight, as if he were accustomed to entering rooms where decisions were made and lives were changed. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the patrol cars, the officers stiff in their uniforms, Lorraine standing firm at Althea's side, and Diane trembling on the sidewalk with a look that hovered between outrage and panic. "Mr. Whitman," Althea greeted him softly, her tone carrying the familiarity of someone who had worked alongside him before. The officers exchanged glances. This wasn't a random passerby. He had been called here, and by Althea no less. Diane's breath caught in her throat. She had expected to be the one seen as credible, the one in control, but this stranger's presence already unsettled her because he wasn't treating Althea like a suspect. He was treating her like a colleague. "Althea," he nodded, his voice steady. "Are you all right?" She inclined her head slightly. "I'm fine," she said, though the heaviness in her eyes betrayed the weariness of having to prove her existence legitimate once again. "But we have a situation that needs clarity." Whitman turned to the officers, his hand reaching into his case. "Daniel Whitman, County Civil Rights Division," he announced, presenting his credentials with practiced precision. The change in the officers' demeanor was immediate. Their shoulders squared, their eyes sharpened. Respect colored their faces now, respect that had not been there moments before when they had first approached Althea at the door. Diane felt her knees weaken. Civil Rights Division. Her mouth went dry, her excuses clogging in her throat. She tried to step forward, to speak, but Whitman's voice cut smoothly across her attempt. "I was contacted because of a possible case of racial profiling unfolding here. We've been monitoring patterns of false reports in predominantly white neighborhoods, reports targeting workers of color who are simply doing their jobs. Ms. Brooks contacted me because she suspected this might escalate beyond misunderstanding, and from the looks of it she was correct." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Diane's head snapped toward Althea.
disbelief flashing across her face. You called him? You. What are you even doing knowing someone like that? Her voice cracked, frantic now, every ounce of control slipping away. Althea finally lifted her chin, her voice quiet but edged with authority. Because I am not only a housekeeper, Diane, I am also a legal researcher with the Civil Rights Division. I've spent the last 10 years documenting cases exactly like this one, where people assume my presence is a threat simply because of how I look. You thought you were exposing me, but all you've done is reveal yourself. The gasp from the crowd of neighbors who had gathered behind their curtains and now on porches and sidewalks was almost audible. For years, Diane had presented herself as the watchful guardian of Willow Creek, the one who cared most about safety and order. And yet here she was, unmasked in the middle of the street, her prejudice laid bare while the woman she tried to humiliate stood in quiet authority. Lorraine folded her arms, her voice sharp as glass. You see, Diane, the woman you tried to brand as a criminal is the one who has more honor and dignity than you will ever understand. She takes care of my children, my home, my peace of mind, and in her spare time she helps fight for justice. That's who you called the police on. That's who you tried to destroy. Diane's face burned crimson. Her eyes darted between the officers, desperate for support. She's lying, she spat. She's making this up to embarrass me. You don't know how manipulative they can be. I saw her going through drawers. I know what I saw. Be specific, Whitman interjected calmly, his tablet already in hand. Which drawers? Which belongings? Did you confirm with the homeowners before calling? Or was your entire report based solely on the fact that a black woman was inside a house you assumed she didn't belong in? The directness of the question cut Diane's defense in half. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, not just the officers, not just Lorraine, but the neighbors now stepping outside, drawn by curiosity and the hum of scandal. Her lies no longer sounded convincing even to herself. Althea watched her unravel with a composure that was almost heartbreaking. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even angry in her expression. She simply looked tired. Tired of carrying herself as both protector and proof, tired of being forced to hold her dignity like a shield against arrows of suspicion. She remembered the countless times delivery drivers had ignored her instructions and asked to speak to the real owner, the store clerks who had followed her down aisles, the neighbors who had asked her when the family would be home, even as she opened the front door with the key in her hand. This morning was not new, but it was sharper, uglier because of the flashing lights and the accusation that could have easily spiraled into handcuffs and headlines.
Lorraine's husband, Charles Bennett, arrived then, his black sedan pulling to a stop behind Whitman's car. He was a man accustomed to boardrooms, his presence commanding, but what defined him most in that moment was not wealth, it was fury. He strode across the pavement, his voice booming. What is going on here? Lorraine stepped forward, her voice still tight with anger. Our neighbor called the police on Althea, told them she was a burglar. Charles turned his gaze on Diane, his eyes narrowing with disgust. You dragged officers into this. You humiliated an innocent woman in front of the whole neighborhood? His words struck like blows, and Diane staggered under them, her composure fraying further. Whitman calmly raised his tablet. It will all be documented, he said simply. Every word, every false claim, every piece of this morning will be added to our records. Diane shook her head wildly, her voice rising in desperation. You're twisting this. I was just being cautious. That's all. Anyone would have done the same. No, Lorraine shot back, her tone steady but fierce. No one else would have done this. No one else would have called police because a woman was cleaning her employer's home. This isn't caution, Diane. This is prejudice. And today it ends. The finality in her words silenced even the hum of the crowd. Diane felt the ground tilt beneath her world collapsing in on itself. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but all she could see was the calm strength in Althea's eyes, the quiet authority in Whitman's presence, and the fierce loyalty in Lorraine's stance. The truth was no longer hidden. It was standing in the open, undeniable, unshakable. Althea folded her hands, her voice softer now but laced with iron. You thought I was powerless, Diane. You thought I was just someone you could erase with a phone call, but you never asked who I really was, what I carried, or how many others I've stood beside in moments just like this. You underestimated me, and that more than anything is your downfall. The silence that followed was deafening. Diane's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes darting to the officers for rescue, but there was none to be found. Her own words had betrayed her, her own prejudice had been her undoing. The truth had come out, and in the open light of morning it was merciless. The silence that settled over Willow Creek was heavier than the flashing lights or the clipped radio calls from the squad cars. It was the silence that follows when the truth finally arrives, and no one can pretend not to see it. Diane Mercer stood rooted on the sidewalk, her throat dry, her mind scrambling for explanations that no longer carried weight. The neighbors who had stepped out of their houses, first out of curiosity, then out of disbelief, were now staring at her with a mix of pity and disgust. Every detail of the morning had unraveled into something she had not expected. She had planned for humiliation, yes, but not her own. Lorraine Bennett remained by Althea's side, her arm looped protectively through hers as though making a public declaration. Charles Bennett's face was carved with anger, his gaze fixed on Diane in a way that made her feel stripped bare. Daniel Whitman from the Civil Rights Division tapped a few final notes into his tablet, his calm voice breaking the silence. "Officers, we've seen enough. Ms. Brooks has provided documentation, identification, house keys, and a personal confirmation from the homeowners. There is no legal basis for her detainment or suspicion. What remains here is not a criminal case but a social one, an example of prejudice resulting in misuse of police resources." Sergeant Klein nodded, his voice subdued. "Understood, Mr. Whitman." He turned to Althea, his posture softening. "Ma'am, on behalf of the department, we apologize for the inconvenience. You were cooperative, respectful, and fully transparent. This should never have escalated as it did." Althea inclined her head politely, though inside her chest the apology twisted into something bittersweet. She had heard those words before, in other towns, other jobs. They soothed, but they did not heal, because the wound was not in the inconvenience. It was in the assumption that she could be guilty before being given the chance to prove innocence. She responded softly, "Thank you, officer. I accept your words, but I hope this moment will be remembered for more than a misunderstanding." Lorraine's eyes glistened with restrained tears. "It will," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of someone used to commanding operating rooms where lives depended on every syllable. "Because I will make sure no one forgets what happened here today." She turned to Diane, her tone cutting but not cruel. "You've lived next to us for years, Diane. You could have walked across the street, knocked on my door, asked a question, even just offered a smile. But you chose suspicion over kindness. You chose hate over decency. And now everyone knows it." The sting of those words cut deeper than any reprimand from the police. Diane felt her knees weaken, her body trembling under the scrutiny of neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries with her. She saw Mrs. Keene from 2 doors down shaking her head slowly, Mr. Allen whispering something to his wife as they both looked away from her. The quiet judgment of a community was often harsher than the law, and Diane felt its weight pressing down. Charles Bennett stepped forward then, his voice heavy with both anger and disappointment. "Do you understand what you could have caused today? Do you understand what it means when you call police with false claims, when you describe an innocent woman as a criminal because of her skin? These things don't end with apologies, Diane. They end with lives destroyed, families shattered. But you didn't care. You wanted to feel powerful for a few minutes, and you risked her dignity, her safety, for your own bitterness." Diane tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. She whispered, "I didn't mean," before trailing off into silence. She didn't mean. The hollowness of that defense rang louder than shouting. Althea finally stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "You did mean it, Diane. You may not have meant for it to go this far, but you meant every word you said when you picked up the phone. You meant every judgment you passed as you watched me from your window. That's the problem. It doesn't take hatred carved into stone to hurt someone. It only takes moments of prejudice disguised as caution." The officers began dispersing, their radios crackling with calls to return to patrol. The lights dimmed, but the weight of the morning remained. Whitman closed his case with a quiet snap, his voice steady. "Ms. Mercer, you won't be charged today, but this incident will be documented, and if your name surfaces again in similar reports, it will not be dismissed as coincidence. I suggest you reflect very carefully on how you view the people around you."
Diane's eyes burned with unshed tears, but they were not the tears of remorse. They were the tears of someone who realized too late that her actions had consequences she could not control. She turned slightly, desperate to retreat to the safety of her home, but the stares of her neighbors followed her, branding her with shame. She had thought herself the watchful guardian of the street, now she was exposed as its pariah. As the last squad car pulled away, Lorraine turned to Althea, her voice warm again. "You don't have to stay here today. Let me take you home. Let me make sure you're all right." Althea shook her head gently, her eyes soft but resolute. "This is my workday. I'll finish it. Dignity means standing where I belong, not running from someone else's attempt to push me out." The quiet strength in her words made Lorraine's throat tighten, pride and sorrow mingling. The crowd of neighbors slowly melted back into their homes, but whispers lingered. That evening Diane sat alone in her living room, blinds closed, phone silent. She had always craved attention, but now it came in the form of isolation. No one rang her doorbell, no one waved as they passed. She had become a story whispered about at dinner tables, her name attached to shame. For Althea, life moved forward, but not without change. Weeks later she stood in a community center, Whitman by her side, speaking to an audience about racial profiling. She described what had happened in Willow Creek, not with bitterness, but with clarity, using the pain of that morning as fuel for change. The audience applauded, some with tears in their eyes, as she reminded them that prejudice thrives in silence, and must be challenged in the open. Months later still, Althea walked onto a stage at a citywide gala, the lights bright, the applause thunderous. She received an award for her contributions to justice, her voice echoing through the hall as she said, "This honor is not just mine. It belongs to every person who has been doubted for who they are before they are known for what they do. It belongs to those who choose dignity over hate, who choose perseverance over bitterness." Lorraine and Charles sat in the front row, their applause the loudest, their faces glowing with pride for the woman they considered family. Meanwhile Diane's life shrank, her friendships withered, her invitations stopped. She sold her house within the year, the value undercut by whispers that no one wanted to live beside her shadow. She moved into a smaller place miles away, carrying boxes not just of furniture, but of regret she could not name aloud. In her darkest moments she replayed that morning in her mind. The call, the flashing lights, the humiliation, and wondered how she had thought herself the hero. But Althea never wasted thought on Diane. Her story had become larger than that one neighbor, larger than that one cul-de-sac. She continued her work at the Civil Rights Division, balancing it with the peace she still found in the quiet rhythm of her cleaning. Because for her, sweeping floors and polishing tables was never about servitude. It was about creating order, about dignity in even the smallest tasks. And in that dignity, she found strength greater than any insult could tear down. The true justice was not Diane's downfall. It was Althea's rise. And as the years passed, Willow Creek remembered not the bitterness of one neighbor, but the resilience of one woman who proved that calm truth could outshine the loudest lie. If this story stirred something in your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe, because we bring you stories that prove dignity always wins over prejudice. But here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly, just for how you looked or where you came from? Share your story in the comments. I promise someone out there needs to read it.